Cool. So last time we went through the ACL graft considerations, which was kind of like weeks 2 to 10, 2 to 12. So today's session is just a carry on and a flow on, but specifically around running. Aaron, I know that we discussed potentially looking at when to start changing direction and more of the cutting techniques. I had a real deep think and a deep insight around that. And I think we've got to understand, first of all of the implications of running in a straight line first. And then maybe that can be the next PD session that we'll go through. Will be, okay, once you're running, then what are the considerations around changing direction and cutting? So today's just around this ACL running. Now, I know that both of you guys are very good at this. So a lot of the stuff that I'll do, we'll pop this on YouTube on the Optimus channel as well. But a lot of this will be for some of the S&C team, and then for any new grads that come on board as well, they can all watch this PD. And hopefully this just really solidifies your guys' understanding of, okay, well, these are the things that we really want to think of from an evidence-based perspective when we're looking at return to run. Cool, good with that?
Awesome.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So it is really important to go back and watch the previous PD that we've done on the YouTube channel. The graft considerations, vascular implications, structural, that inflammatory cascade, and the pre-reading of that inflammatory cascade is super important to understand all of that before we go into this. Now, that inflammatory cascade pre-reading, I'll make sure that there's a link in the comments or in the description of the video. But effectively what that inflammatory cascade goes through is understanding from a physiological level what happens to different structures, bones, muscles, mainly bone, in an ACL repair. So keep this picture in mind throughout the whole session today. Just that quad tendon graft harvest. It's such a cool picture. I just love it so much. It just shows so much detail around all the structures that might be involved when not even just putting in a new ACL, it's just harvesting the graft of a new quads tendon. So just a quick summary of that bone remodeling process, and looking at a timeline of kind of 10 to 14 weeks. We know that soft callus has formed through the tibial tunnels after an ACL reco. And it doesn't matter what graft you have, we know that soft callus has formed. Most of the time, lower limb bones take 12 weeks, and I say that 12-week mark because it could be sooner, it could be later. It depends on surgical techniques. It depends on a whole bunch of different factors. But on average, it takes 12 weeks for those bone tunnels to really shut and lock down and go from sort of a soft callus to a hard callus and lock down on the graft. So running, where does this come into it after ACL reco? When you run in a straight line, your musculoskeletal system, and when I say the MSK system, we're talking about everything from the foot, the ankle, up through the shin, to the knee, up through the thigh, into the hips and the lower back. All of that has to absorb significant amounts of ground reaction force. And this is where we'll get really particular. All right, it's up to us as physiotherapists and as professionals to guide a lot of people, being strength and conditioning coaches, being personal trainers, even when our clients are seeing myotherapist or remedial massage. This is the kind of knowledge and expertise that I think that we need to drive and really educate the client so that they can then go and educate the rest of the team. But in short, we have to be able to absorb 3 to 4 times body weight in ground reaction forces. In terms of what do we look at for a physio perspective and objective measures and testing these things, you know, where a lot of the time, I don't know about you guys, but in my experience, a lot of people ask around, oh, you know, when can I start running? When can I start running? You'll see in the States after 4 to 6 weeks where, you know, some people who have healed really well and they don't have these considerations at play and they don't take note of these details, they'll be running after 6 weeks. We've seen a lot of that. But then also it goes for the client and the patient that's had an ACL reco, they haven't done anything for a couple of months, and they might be 3 or 4 months later looking at week 16, week 18, and they come and see us for the first time, and they've either been running very poorly, or they are really delayed and they actually have no idea around when they can start running. So hopefully this gives us lots of clarity today. Comparing running to walking, right? Because a lot of the time you'll see after an ACL reco, you're off crutches and the patient's walking pretty well. Generally by kind of week 4, we want them off crutches completely, outdoors, walking fair amounts. And you can see here that the magnitude of peak vertical ground reaction force when you're running is double effectively walking, right? So when you go from 1,000 to 2,000, that's a huge step up. And so this is where we have to be detail oriented to ensure that everything that we're doing, objective measures based and evidence based, is giving our clients and our patients who have had ACL recos the best possible opportunity to heal and gradually progress through to that 2,000 units of vertical ground reaction force. I freak out sometimes when someone, you know, I don't see an ACL client for a couple of weeks and we've been doing walking based ground reaction forces, and all of a sudden they come and they say, oh yeah, I went for a 10-minute jog. And it's that kind of stuff where that's where you can just throw in some kind of flags, and you know that you have to probably educate them more and hold them back because they're just going to be gung-ho and really doing a lot of these things. Now, a lot of the time, their body and their tissues are capable of absorbing those forces, and that's why they run no problems. But for us, and especially at Optimus, we like to be measured and really evidence-based and really clinical. That term clinical being, you know, we measure things and progress as we hit those certain markers. Any questions on that so far?
All good.
Nope.
The other thing with this as well is it's actually really interesting information if someone's got, you know, stress fractures, or they have, say, an ATFL avulsion, or they've got a syndesmosis, or they've got hip labral issues. All of these evidence-based data and mathematics and the whole kind of theme of this presentation, you can use in all of those injuries as well, right? Because running's running, and a lot of the time when we're treating even just a hamstring, we know what these vertical ground reaction forces are in running. It's not specific to an ACL population. So the question is, again, with this lovely picture, at what stage do you think can this knee that was like this, let's say 10 weeks ago, at what stage can this knee absorb these forces? And that's the question that we have to ask ourselves. And this is also why I love being in surgery, because it gives physios a real appreciation of the physiological damage that the surgery does in an ACL reco. So at what stage can that knee absorb these forces? Let's go into specifics, right? So running and the specifics of running, I'll just check here. Just trying to, yeah, cool. So the specifics of running, a ground contact time of jogging varies between 99 to 172 milliseconds. Now, that's just based on these 3 studies and averages. through an average population. A sprinter, it might be much faster. But for us, generally, what we're looking for is that ground contact time is really, really short. So we need to ask ourselves the questions in that lead up to, can you jog or can you run? You know, are they doing significant hopping, or can I say high quality hopping, where that ground contact time, single leg, is less than 170 milliseconds? Because if they're doing things that is, you know, 300 to 400 milliseconds of hops, and then all of a sudden they go, all right, cool, let's go, bang, let's go for a run, you're really shortening that time of ground contact time. The other one is the ground reaction forces, right? And this is really hard to measure if you don't have, say, a valid force X, which we do. We're really lucky to have that. But it's extremely difficult to measure those ground reaction forces without that. Again, for physios who don't have access to these things, it would be wise to send your client off, especially at this crucial time frame of, okay, can we run or can't? And then the third thing to look at is, can that knee that only 10 weeks ago looked like that, can it produce and absorb a rate of force development up to 12,000 newtons per second, right? So these three considerations is based on the skills and the capacities that we require for running. So now that we know that, let's actually go through the skills and the capacities that we require for running. I'm going to focus on three of them. There's a brilliant article online that goes through all of this. This is where a lot of these tables and the format of these tables are taken from. But what I will do is, in the references, in the comments, and in the description of the video, all of those references will be put in there. Okay. So number one, mobility.
Which article was that, Brian, out of curiosity, just so I can keep an eye out for the name?
I'll send it through to you. I'll put it in the Zoom chat here. Yeah.
Cool.
So the first one being mobility, right? So if our ankle, knee, hip joints don't have the appropriate mobility for jogging, then we're in trouble. And a lot of the time I'll see this is when, you know, you especially in the States, when you see those kind of 6-week runners, they don't have an extension of -5 degrees, right? When people start running after an ACL reco and they have a, you know, -15 degree extension, I cringe, because you're already starting to train through motor neuron patterns. Sorry, I don't know if you guys can hear all the sirens. Can you hear that, or you can't?
There we go.
Sweet. So yeah, so if you start running before you have the knee range of motion, that's terrible. And this is where I know Mick Hughes is really good when he says a quiet knee. So Randall Cooper and Mick Hughes in their Melbourne knee score, that's actually really good at documenting from an overview perspective of, do you actually have a quiet knee and can you start jogging? Mobility is one phase, but can you see the difference in knee flexion from just jogging compared to running at 4 meters per second? It's a huge difference. Same thing with the hip, knee, and ankle. One thing that I commonly have is that the ankle doesn't have enough dorsiflexion at that 10-week mark, right? Usually the calves are super tight and the ankle just does not have the ability to get that amount of dorsiflexion. Plantar flexion, no problems. But yeah, if the key mobility aspects of this, if you're not ticking that off really early on, then forget about running. Cool. Any questions on that one? It's actually not that demanding. Like if you think of 45 degrees hip flexion, you know, 20 degrees of dorsiflexion and 90 degrees of knee, flexion, like those flexion amounts are not that much. And usually we want to be hitting this between kind of weeks 4 to 8.
Okay.
The next one, moving on from mobility, is the strength. In that, does the body have the ability to produce these forces and absorb these forces from a eccentric and a concentric ability at that jogging at 3.5 meters per second, right? So can that musculature absorb and produce forces enough that will be 2.4 times ground reaction force relative to body weight? So let's say that's 100 kilo male. We're looking at 240. 100 kilo male. We're looking at 240 kilos of force in this relative lower limb. Okay, so when we talk about ground reaction force relative to body weight, it's just a force. It's obviously very different at the ankle, different levers at the knee, at the hip, but we're just kind of talking at overall, can your body absorb 2.4 times or 240 kilos in that 100 kilo male? Now, in a 50 kilo smaller male, that is very different, right? So what you're looking at just over 130 kilograms for a 50 kilo male. And that's where it's super important that all of this is relevant to the individual client. And again, back to this, all of it is individual to that specific client. What graft have they had? You know, is it a hamstring graft or a quad tendon graft? Is it a patella bone graft? Is it a Lars graft? I haven't seen that for a while, but all of this is individualized, right? And that's why you can see that everything is relative to body weight, especially when we're just doing body weight movements. And when we're speaking about running, effectively running is a plyometric hopping from one leg to the other, where there's at one point in time, both feet off the ground, okay? You can see that that increases significantly when you go from running at 4 meters per second to maximum speeds. Now, that's a whole nother series, because today we're just focusing on walking to jogging. But you can see that once you accelerate, so even if you accelerate from walking to jogging at 3.5 meters per second, you do get this spike in ground reaction forces, okay? And this is where I want you guys to be really focused on. When you're doing hopping exercises, just know that you're probably working on the acceleration aspect of that up to 3.1 times ground reaction force relative to body weight, compared to just jogging in a straight line. And that's really important, because a lot of the time, you know, people will go from walking and then ease up into a jog, and that will be completely fine. But it's once they start adding acceleration and deceleration into it that we actually are loading the tissues much more. So this is why running in itself is just a PD after ACL, because there's so much in getting to that point, but then also in just these tiny little modifications.
Sorry, Brian. When we're actually looking at the force deck data, I guess more specifically with the single leg hops on the force deck, at that 12, 13 week mark, are these the values that we'd be looking for? So when they're like, are they able to absorb 2.4 times your body weight, single leg on each side? And how would this relate to that data from, I guess, not from the concentric phase as well? Because I feel like I've been ignoring the concentric phase in the first testing in that 12 weeks and focusing only on the eccentric.
Yeah, so remember, these are peak forces, right? And doing that single leg hop on the force decks is absolutely brilliant, because it gives you a very specific graph pattern that you're looking at. Now, from an overview perspective, if people can't hit those peak forces, you then need to really delve into their strength, right? So you take it back a step and you go, okay, you can do a single leg hop. You can't hit those ground reaction forces. Why? And this is where you have to really pull it back a step, and that's why that 1 second, mate. There's a guy just deciding to go up in some sort of construction thing right next to me. This is the joys of working not in an office. Yeah, speaking. I'm just thinking, can I go somewhere else? No, you're right. He should be done shortly. He's very high. He's very, very, very high. Going up onto a roof. How noisy is it? Like, can you guys hear that beep pretty loud?
Yeah, but we can also hear you pretty well as well.
Yeah,
okay,
you're pretty clear.
Yeah.
All right, cool. I'll just keep going because I've got my AirPods in, so just as long as you guys can hear me. So this is talking about peak forces, right? Having a look at the force decks at that single leg hop. Yes, you want to look at, can you hit these peaks, right? Can your body absorb these peak vertical ground reaction forces? But then it is super important to look at the how. How are they producing those forces?
Yeah.
Is their rate of force development in the early phase or in the mid phase or at takeoff? What is the rate of force development like? And that's what you have to look at and compare to others. And then you also have to look at the absorption, right? Is there a massive spike on that landing? Are the forces huge and the peak forces are actually huge, but you're getting that as a significant spike in a tiny little millisecond time frame? And that goes to show that, okay, yes, you're getting these huge forces, but are they actually absorbing it correctly? And are they dispersing that force well across the ankle, the knee, most importantly, and the hip? And this is where you'll see a lot of tricking measures, especially on that single leg hop. You can see that people will have heaps more hip flexion, way too much hip flexion, and almost nothing through the knee. And this is where kind of you start to break down into quality of those specific single leg hops. That's another whole kind of hour worth already. And we can go through that a lot more, but you're right. This is what you want to be looking at, is the how are they producing those forces is still extremely important. Going back to this slide, if they're not producing the forces, number one you have to look at is, do they have the mobility to use their joint entirely? And a lot of the time you'll see in the hops that the ACL specific client, they do not have 90 degrees of knee flexion, and then they do not have the strength appropriate to be able to absorb through a range of motion of 90 degrees, right? So if they can't do a single leg drop squat to 90 degrees, there's no way they should be running, because we know for a fact that you can't, even statically and really slowly, absorb forces through your quads to 90 degrees. And then that's where we come into it. It's kind of like, okay, well, are your quads just not strong enough? Or is it a joint capsule problem? Or is it a tightness from a muscular perspective? They can't get to the 90 degrees for range of motion. If they can, okay, cool. From a passive perspective, then let's look at active. And if they can't get to 90 and hold a single leg squat in that position, or at least reach that 90 degrees, and that's why, you know, in the pitch ready testing, you've got that single leg squat that you need to be able to do 3 to 5. If you run 100 steps effectively at 3.5 meters per second, you are doing a single leg squat really quickly, mind you, but you're doing a single leg squat to that 90 degrees. So it's good that we've got those values and looking at it from an overall perspective. It just allows us to go, okay, you're not hitting the peak forces. Why? And then that kind of brings us back. It also allows us to set really good targets to our clients as well. You know, we can say to them, look, you're hitting 6 times your body weight on this eccentric component, and it's all happening within this tiny little time frame. Then you show them the video and you can actually see that ankles super stiff, knees super stiff, and everything's happening just in their hips and they're just folding. And that's why it's important to add this objective quantitative data to the qualitative movement as well. Does that answer your question in a very roundabout way?
Yeah, I guess also with that quality of movement though, like wouldn't that also be apparent when you're looking at the graphs and like on their landing, if you see multiple peaks, so then you'd be thinking like, okay, are they not getting that range in one of the 3 joints?
Yeah, yeah,
okay.
Spot on. Yeah, and look, even if you don't have forced X, right, you can observe these things when someone is doing just a triple hop or a single leg hop on the spot, or pogo hops, double leg. You know, you can find these tricking measures, and the pitch ready stuff allows us to really quantify things. But you'll hear Tim from Pitch Ready talk about the qualitative, and he's excellent at that. And that will be as part of the follow-up readings and follow-up course for this is his work on the Physio Network. He discusses that qualitative aspect really, really well. Cool. So, strength, ground reaction force relative to body weight, 2.4 times your body weight in jogging 3.5 meters per second. All right, cool. Those are cool numbers, but what does it actually mean? So let's compare it to some other exercises, right? So we're looking at the bottom orange bar here. So forward running at 3.6 meters per second. What they've done is the load being body weight, they have put it into a single leg, the ground reaction force relative to body weight. And the single leg is at 2.7 times body weight, right? And this is, again, this is just an average. And what does that mean? If you then work backwards from there and you look at tuck jumps, right? When you do a tuck jump, the ground reaction force relative to body weight, because it's a bilateral exercise, you're actually looking at 5 times your body weight. Now, in an ideal world, you're putting 50-50 through your left and your right. And then so what we've done here is we've gone, okay, we've estimated that doing a tuck jump will put 2.5 times your body weight of force through one limb. Then you go backwards and backwards and backwards, and you kind of get up to the vertical jump, right? So just below jogging 2.5 meters per second in the orange line, you've got vertical jump. Just doing a vertical jump will only put 1.67 times your body ground reaction force relative to body weight through a single limb. And this is just such a good table because I actually use this a lot in the progressions, and I'll show my clients this a lot as well. If you do a squat jump, you're putting less force through a single limb than you would be at jogging at 2.5 meters per second. Now, I reckon I can walk at 2.5 meters per second, right? So that's super, super slow jogging. And a lot of people, when they get to jogging, you know, you don't want to be jogging even that slowly if you can't do a squat jump and there's no swelling within 24 hours. So always going back to this, thinking about this knee is, can that knee, be it after 10 weeks, be it after 12 weeks, be it after 14 weeks, and having a significant understanding of the healing and the physiological healing of this knee, can it absorb any of these things, right? And this is where guided progression is important. And this is why the lower limb rehab groups are so fantastic because we can do this. You know, sometimes I'll have people progress in a single session from vertical jump, so 1.67 times body weight, down to side jumps and adding a lateral vector to 1.9 times. And usually all of those things in between, you have to remember, it's not just about the peak forces and the peak vertical ground reaction forces. It's also about total load. So I wouldn't get someone doing 100 vertical jumps and going, okay, cool, you're only at 1.67 times body weight. 100 vertical jumps, again, has another impact and aspect of the capacity of all of those structures. So this is just a good overview and a good kind of cheat sheet for peak forces. But remember that if you're doing this once, it's very, very different to doing it 5 times. It's very, very different, again, loading all these tissues from a capacity perspective if you do it 50 times. Okay, so your dosages are still super important. This only takes into account one aspect, and that's peak ground reaction forces relative to body weight in the single leg overall. Question for you guys. Does any of those exercises really surprise you?
I would have said side to side jumps being so low.
And
form skipping being so high, actually.
Yeah, you see the side to side jumps being 3.8 in the bilateral column. That means that it's a bilateral exercise. So literally jumping side to side, and then it's not a single leg.
Yeah, okay. Because that's what I was thinking.
The step up surprised me a little bit.
Yeah.
And why? Why do you think? And you see how it says load is 5 rep max though. Okay, so step up, that's not body weight. That's a 5 rep max.
Oh, gotcha. That makes sense.
Yeah. And most of the time that's quite a lot. Like if you think about the step ups that we do in the performance center, we've probably got someone, 5 rep max is barbell with 20 to 60 kilos on.
Mm-hmm.
The only one was form skipping. I didn't think would be that high.
Yeah, super high forces. And this is where, can you see where like you introduce some jumps and if you go through, Lucky Wilmot's plyometric progressions and compare it to this graph here, he's pretty spot on, but the difference in going from static exercises to plyometrics is huge. The gap is massive, and a lot of people who don't understand this detail will just go straight from static to intense plyometric. And you can see how much of a gap it is in forcing and stressing a brand new ACL, maybe a not closed tibial bone tunnel and femoral bone tunnel. There's only soft callus around that graft, and people were going through and doing significantly higher forces. So the first 12 weeks in an ACL after an ACL reconstruction is very, very technical. There's not a whole lot of research and data that is guided by these forces or, accelerating forces in those first 12 weeks when there's only soft callus in the tibial tunnel. There's a few research articles around graft laxity or graft lengthening, but there's not a whole lot around, problems after the first 12 weeks of people doing rehab too aggressively. Cool. Then, of course, the next part, if you add in your mobility and you add in your strength, you need to be able to control all of these, and coordination is just so important, right? A lot of the time, yes, maybe someone has got all of those things in place. They've got that 90 degrees of knee flexion. They've got 45 degrees of hip flexion. They can get the ankle to 20 degrees of dorsiflexion. But can they do that in the appropriate timing, the appropriate coordination with the proper technique to be able to get into those positions? So motor control is the third aspect, right? And look, I know that this is a really, really complex, overarching umbrella term of motor control, but the details implies that the better you get at these movements and the better motor control you get at these movements, the easier running becomes and the less force you produce in running. And so that's where I'll leave it today, is just with those specifics and with lovely mathematical tables. And what I'd like you guys to do is over the next couple of weeks, so the next 2 weeks, is use this graph. Use this graph in your progressions of exercises with, it doesn't matter who, but let's say lower limb clients, right? So ankle injuries, dancers, footballers, tradies, anyone that you're progressing through a lower limb injury, use this exercise, and then we'll discuss again in 2 weeks' time.
Cool.
Cool. So the key take-home messages from this one today is that the ground reaction forces are really high in running. You need to be aware of which anatomical aspects are being loaded, and usually in running, it's all of them. You know, it's ankle, knee, hip, lower back, plus everything that connects to it. The strength-related capacities are the hardest ones to develop, right? And this is why strengthening 3 times a week has to be a minimum, because if you're not overloading, if you're not progressively overloading muscular tissue, you're not getting the strength. And if you can't do a single leg squat to 90 degrees off a box by week 10, by week 12, you shouldn't be running. And that's the biggest one that I see in not only my ACL clients, but in a lot of other ACL clients, is that they actually just don't have the muscular strength. It just takes the longest, you know. Muscle hypertrophy takes 6 weeks minimum. The forces that you need to produce when running happen very, very quickly, right? So less than 170 milliseconds. And skill is super important in this. And that's why you see we've got the triple extension picture here. Skill and technique of running and skill and technique of hopping, which is what the next session will be about. That's also extremely important. And then lastly, ensure that you understand that an exercise progression based only on peak ground reaction forces is very limited, right? It's not taking into account all of the considerations that we need to in ACL rehab, but it is just a really good kind of base level to understand about amounts of forces on particular tissues. Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Any questions?
That's good.
Oh. Just share.